Today, many tough questions are being asked about beliefs that have been held for centuries. Did Jesus really say and do what the Bible reports? Did the gospel writers of the Bible's New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really give us a true account of the life and works of Jesus? Are there secrets now revealed about the Christian faith? And what about other gospel documents that contradict the biblical story of Jesus? Jesus and the Gospels, Answers to Tough Questions, Part 1, on this day of discovery.
This is an impressive display of early Christian art and artifacts in the Bible Lands Museum of Jerusalem. It's a reminder that ever since Jesus himself walked this land, he inspired, united, and divided. Even to this day, many don't know what to think when they hear about a Jesus who, according to the Gospels, walked on water and raised the dead. On the other hand, there are also today many who, having accepted what the New Testament said about Jesus, find themselves not knowing what to think when they read in the newspapers about another relic or a new gospel that claims to tell a different story than that told by the Bible.
Well, today it is a confusing landscape because what people are hearing is that there are secrets that the church has kept for millennia, that there are truths about Jesus that the church doesn't want the public to discover.
Again and again, we find that the two seasons of the year that these are regularly announced will be either Christmas or Easter, Lent Easter. It's amazing, again and again.
They're hearing that there are all kinds of gospels outside of the New Testament gospels that perhaps are just as good, maybe even better, that show us things about Jesus that are very different. I'm very discouraged and worried about the person in the street who's hearing this strange stuff.
Claims that the Bible is not historically reliable leave the impression that faith in Jesus of Nazareth is based on myths and kept alive by secrets. Such thoughts can be deeply disturbing to those who begin to wonder whether they have put their faith in fiction rather than fact. If you assume, as many do, that all history is biased and often untrue, or that all truth has a natural explanation, then you have to conclude that today's followers of Jesus are walking in the footsteps of someone else's imagination.
Maybe the real Jesus, had a wife and kids and a mortgage, and he really wasn't the Son of God. He really wasn't anyone special through whom God worked. And the New Testament Gospels and the New Testament as a whole simply doesn't tell the truth. That is what concerns me.
One of the challenges that people raise about Christianity is whether or not we can trust the content of the books that we have as being reflective of what was actually written at the time.
Dr. Daniel Wallace is a scholar of the Greek language. He's working to authenticate what was written in the original manuscripts of the New Testament. These are the writings of first-century followers of Jesus, like Matthew, Mark, and John, and people like Luke, a doctor, and the Apostle Paul. In order to confirm the wording of the original documents, Dr. Wallace started a foundation called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts and took on a project of monumental proportion. Locate and digitally photograph every New Testament manuscript in the world, page by page. The purpose is to allow scholars everywhere to compare and evaluate all New Testament documents by internet. Such comparison of manuscripts to determine the most accurate representation of the original wording of a text is called textual criticism.
What textual critics, this is the discipline that it's known as, is textual criticism, trying to determine the wording of the text. What they do is they make a comparison of these manuscripts in terms of the early manuscripts from different regions, and they also look at the early versions and what's called patristic writings, or the writings of the church fathers who are commenting on Scripture.
Because handmade copies of New Testament documents and writings of early church fathers were made in different regions of the Middle East, different families of manuscripts can be compared to one another as a means of determining where textual changes departed from the originals.
Here's a statement in the West, here's a statement in the East, here's one in the North or one in the South, and you put all this together and all saying the same thing. You say, and that's all in the 2nd century. You say this must be what was originally said in the 1st century.
Because complete or partial copies of ancient New Testament manuscripts number in the thousands, researchers like Dr. Wallace can claim a high level of certainty about the original text. By comparison, few copies remain of other Greco-Roman classical documents.
The real struggle that New Testament textual critics have is that they have an embarrassment of riches. And it is an unbelievable embarrassment of riches in comparison with what classical scholars have to work with. The average classical author has fewer than 20 literary remains. So if you take all of the copies of an average classical author, you'll stack no higher than 4 feet tall of all of the copies that still exist today. Now you stack the copies of the New Testament that we have. You start with the Greek manuscripts. We have over 5,700 Greek manuscripts, so that's going to go a little higher than 4 feet, I think. And then you look at the Latin manuscripts, there's over 10,000 in Latin alone. Then we have Syriac, Coptic, Georgian, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, all sorts of languages, and we don't know how many of those we have because they haven't ever been properly cataloged. But the best guess is somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000 for those manuscripts. So that means we've got 20 to 25,000 in ancient versions, and another 5,700 just in Greek.
The New Testament has by far the best ancient attestation of any work from the classical period on the face of the earth. It's just that simple. We have very good reason to believe that what we have in our Bible is actually what was written. Now that doesn't solve the problem of believing what was written. That's a whole separate step.
So why should we believe what was written so long ago? And how can we separate fact from fiction? Can we dismiss the supernatural events recorded in the Gospels as myths or legend? The answers to these questions are within our reach only because of the wealth and weight of well-established textual and historical evidence. A number of scholars believe that the best way to determine the truthfulness of the New Testament accounts is found by comparing the biblical story of Jesus with what we know about the 1st century world. Do the events described in the Gospels have the ring of truth or legend?
Yeah, well, see, historical reliability is not like doing science. I keep saying that, but it's such an important point. How do you judge things are historically true? The historical truth is bottomless. You can keep asking questions and it will make sense. So what you've got to do is step back and say, what was the 1st century world like? How did people tell their stories in the ancient world? Not how we tell them. Can't do that. That's cultural imperialism. We can't expect them to be 21st century people. Let them be 1st century people. Let's ask questions about how did they tell their stories? When they wanted to tell the truth, what did that look like for them? You look at the Gospels in that light and you say, okay, what do these look like? Well, they're not telling myths. That's pretty clear to me, right? Because they don't look like myths. What do I mean? What do I mean here? They don't look like myths. Well, we know what a myth looks like. If you go to a movie, you can tell the difference between a comedy and a police drama. You know the genre. You do the same thing with the Gospels. What do they look like? What's their content? These are not myths. These are biographies. They're making truth claims in the ancient world. How do I judge those truth claims? Well, are they coherent? Do they make sense in terms of 1st century standards? So we might talk about the resurrection. Let's look at that for a second. Right? Well, what did first century Jewish people think about the resurrection? Well, they don't think like Christians. When they think of resurrection, and it's really a Jewish concept, it's not a Greco-Roman one. They're not really interested in resurrections. So that's already told us this is a Jewish story. In the Jewish story, what happens? Well, everybody gets resurrected. Right? Certainly the righteous, some people think maybe the wicked, and then there's a universal judgment. There's a Messiah in Jerusalem. The Romans, they're going to get it, of course, we know that. Creation's going to be restored. There's more new wine than you can imagine. So this is a universal transformation. That's what they mean by resurrection. It's not an isolated idea. Why don't the disciples go to the tomb to see if Jesus has been resurrected? They don't have to. They just look out the window. The world has not changed. No. If there's no universal change, he hasn't been resurrected. Obvious. Now this raises the staggering question. How do you explain a group of Jewish people in that worldview suddenly running around 24 hours later saying, we know all of this, but we're telling you that an individual has been resurrected in the middle of a world that hasn't changed? Now explain to me historically how you get somebody to have that change of mind in the space of 24 hours. Right? Something must have happened. Well, they saw a ghost. Excuse me, they know the difference between a ghost and a resurrection. They know what a resurrection is. They're not saying we saw a ghost. So historically you have to explain that. And I think the best historical explanation is something absolutely stunning and extraordinary and inexplicable happened.
Another more recent objection to Christianity is the idea that there really are a variety of Christianities in the first century. There wasn't just one Christianity.
Over the last few decades, reports have circulated in the popular media about other ancient manuscripts that contradict the New Testament accounts. These other Gospels present a different picture of Jesus that raises questions not only about whether Jesus was married, but more importantly, about whether there was anything supernatural about him at all. Most of these other accounts were discovered rather recently. South of the land of Israel, in Egypt, as recently as 1945, at a place called Nag Hammadi, a number of gospel-like texts were found that date to the 2nd and 3rd century AD. These manuscripts and others from that period are often referred to as the Gnostic Gospels and have names like the Gospel of Thomas, Judas, Mary, or Philip.
Sit down, read one of your New Testament Gospels, and then read the Gospel of Thomas, read the Gospel of Judas next to it, read the Gospel of Mary or Philip or one of those other ancient apocryphal documents, and you'll see such an air of difference in terms of how they think about Jesus, how they think about history. Look at it in terms of the question of which ones put this in a real narrative, which one is just a bunch of sayings. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, is 114 sayings that have zero historical context.
It actually is not a gospel. It's 114 independent sayings of Jesus. Some of them are long, like parables. Some of them are short, like short little maxims or proverbs.
Jesus said, "If your leaders say to you, 'Look, the Father's kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the Father's kingdom is within you, and it is outside you."
Not one city, not one place name is mentioned in them. Jesus doesn't perform one miracle. He doesn't utter one prophecy. He doesn't die for people's sins. He doesn't die at all. He's already resurrected in a mythical form of sorts. And you say, well, how in the world is that open to historical inquiry?
The point here is that this gospel does not reflect the earliest Christianity. But what opponents make of it is, see, here's a Christianity without Jesus at the center, without a cross, and it has just as much age as the Gospels that we have in our Bible. So it's one of those books that didn't make it into the Bible, but perhaps should have been in the Bible, and if it had been in the Bible, we'd get a different Christianity.
And then at the end he says, Peter says, let Mary Magdalene, go out from us because women are not worthy of life. And Jesus said, look, I'll change her into a guy so she can join you guys on the way to heaven.
Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven."
And you're going, you scholars over here are saying the Gospel of Thomas should go into the New Testament and replace the Gospel of John, which some of them are saying, and you want this saying in there?
So how did these other secret Gospels come to be? Many scholars believe that they represent the thinking of an early cult or split from Christianity that modified and changed the teaching of Jesus by mixing it with the Greek philosophy of Plato. Often called Gnostic Gospels, they get their name from the Greek word gnosis, that means knowledge. They claim secret knowledge about Jesus and how to escape the physical world to reach God.
Now, most recently, the latest caricature in Christ is that he was in cahoots with Judas in designing his own passion. And that was the gift the National Geographic gave us last year at this time, called the Judas Gospel.
And when this text was found, the claim was made, see, here's proof that there were alternative Christianities. Here's a group that elevates Judas to a high point of appreciation and to a high point of honor. In fact, he is more honorable than all the rest of the 12. It's kind of the gospel story turned on its head. And in that process, the idea is, see, here's a picture of reconciliation and the determinism of God, that because Judas did what God called him to do, he did an honorable thing.
Now, again, I'm kind of glad this document was discovered, because this underlies the accuracy of one of the early church defenders of the faith, Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon. In 180 AD, he wrote a book called Against Heresies. He's primarily targeting Gnosticism, that earliest Christian heresy. And he says that there was a strange group in his day that named themselves after the first murderer in history, Cain. They were called the Cainites. And Bishop Irenaeus says they have conceived an impious, false piece of writing called the Judas Gospel. And we had only the name across 19 centuries. Now we have the document itself. So I'm really glad that this was published. And there's one line of interest, of course, which made all the sensationalism, and that is when Judas hears Jesus tell him, "You will exceed them all, Judas, because you will liberate me from the man who clothes me."
Judas said to Jesus, "Look, what will those who have been baptized in your name do?" Jesus said, "But you, Judas, will exceed all of them, for you will liberate the man that clothes me."
In other words, Jesus is a Neoplatonist. He wants to get out of this prison house of the mortal body and fly away to some Platonist spiritual existence. This isn't the Jesus I know. And of course, this is simply a totally ridiculous statement. And there are only two or three other normal declarative sentences in the whole document. Another one, Jesus seems to change his mind about Judas. And he says, "Judas, your star has misled you," he says. Another time, Judas says to Jesus, "I know where you have come from. You have come from the immortal realm of Barbelo." Now that's spelled B-A-R-B-E-L-O. Don't spend any time trying to find it on any atlas.
Well, here's what they didn't tell you about the Gospel of Judas. If you actually read through the Gospel of Judas, and you can do that, you can go online. It's only about 7 pages long. It only covers 3 days of the life of Jesus during the last week. You will get all this cosmology. Now that's how the creation came into being.
According to the Gospel of Judas, it wasn't God who created the world. It was underling gods or lower gods, and they created a world in trouble.
The creation, to put it simply, was corrupt from the very beginning. It was not created very good, it was created very bad. And this is a clue that this material could not go back to the earliest Christians, because the earliest Christians inherited the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And in doing so, they believed there was one creator, and that creation was very good from the beginning, and that the fault that existed in the creation didn't go back to God's work of creation, it went back to other factors. So the moment someone brought a cosmology that said the creation was bad from the beginning, they would go, nope, can't be. So that's why the Gospel of Judas never made it into the Bible.
The stuff outside the New Testament is from a much later period of time, faraway places, groups with minimal and maybe no connection at all to the apostolic tradition. And so a lot of people, I think, get the impression that there were dozens of Gospels floating around in the first century, and that the four that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were arbitrarily selected. And these other ones, Thomas, Peter, Philip, Mary, and these other Gospels, were somehow unfairly marginalized, pushed aside, maybe because of some kind of conspiracy, maybe because they tell us things about Jesus we really don't want others to know. And that is rubbish. That isn't what happened. These other Gospels outside the New Testament are from a later period of time that want to say things, want to claim Jesus taught things that everybody knows he didn't teach, for which there is no apostolic evidence for which there's no ancient tradition supporting. And so they're making it up in the second century, because they want to hold to different views. They like some of Jesus' teachings, but they want to hold to something else. Oh, if only Jesus had taught that would help, because then it would support our view. Oh, I know. Well, then why don't we have Jesus say that? And so they write up a new gospel. And so there's a tiny bit, you might say, of apostolic truth in their gospel, just a little, just enough to make it seem almost plausible. And then they add in all this stuff about different layers of heaven and different deities and Gnostic kinds of ideas and beginnings and all kinds of stuff that Jesus never taught. And scholars know that. Real scholars know that. But the popular writers misrepresent it and mislead us.
Now, how do you sort this out? What used to happen was that this information would be studied by scholars, it would be placed in journals, it would be what's called vetted or fact-checked for its accuracy before it came out, and the scholars would discuss it, and then it would hit the public square. That's not happening anymore. Now what's happening is people are coming directly to the public square with the information. So what do you do when that happens, when you hear of the latest, greatest new discovery that's going to change history? I think the simple thing to say to you is take a deep breath, take 3 deep breaths, go to Starbucks, have a coffee, and let the discussion sort itself out in public. It will sort itself out in public. Usually it's pretty carefully covered. And it often will take place, the vetting will take place in virtual time, over the internet, in internet exchanges and that kind of thing. And it will take some time for all the facts to get out, for people to assess what the original claims are. And so it will just take some time. So usually the announcements of these discoveries need a great deal of patience before we actually know what's going on.
Archaeological and manuscript discoveries, in my experience in the last 30 plus years, have opened up my eyes to see new things, but never undermine faith. Either confirm faith or clarify aspects of faith that we didn't know very well before.
So I hope now that maybe you can appreciate just a little bit more that it's not necessarily a bad thing that Jesus has been controversial for the last 2,000 years. Now it's a good thing that the Bible's claims have been able to be tested over and over again by scholars who have looked at the relics, they've looked at the art, they've examined the ancient texts, the stories of individuals and nations that have been influenced and affected by Jesus of Nazareth. I hope also that this will be reason for those of you who already believe in him to take him even more seriously. And if you still have doubts, take another look for yourself. Open up the gospel accounts. Read the story of this individual, this man who claimed to be Messiah and Savior. Test the evidence. Read the story for yourself.